Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. We are here, five of us lawyers, in various areas of practice, to talk about how we see the second Trump administration impacting international businesses. The format of today will be that each of us will speak for 3 to 4 minutes on our area of expertise, and then we are going to open this up for questions. The key here is really going to be your questions. You have already, there are more than 100 of you out there, and you have already armed us with about 25 questions, but I urge everyone to keep pestering us with questions. I believe there's a way for you to do so. Just write them in, we will see them, and the questions you have asked and the questions that you asked during this will be prioritized. So without further ado, let us begin, and I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker. It's Adams Lee. Adams is an international trade lawyer whose practice centers on imports and exports, tariffs and duties, trade sanctions impacting countries and individuals. Adams heads up our international trade practice, and obviously he's going to have a lot of relevant things to talk about. And I'm going to turn it over now to Adams.
It's deja vu all over again. 8 years ago, Trump had just been elected, and I and many others were doubting whether he'd actually impose any of the tariffs he talked about during the campaign, but he sure did. Today, his original tariffs are still in place, but now he wants to impose an exponentially larger set of tariffs. We're talking trillions, not just billions of dollars of trade value affected. His proposed tariffs still seem like a terrible idea, but now most people don't think he's bluffing. So what kind of tariffs are we talking about here? For China, he's talking about 60% on all Chinese imports, not just some like last time. He also wants to impose 10 or maybe even 20% tariffs on all imports from all countries. He's also singled out Mexico. He said 25% on everything or 200% on Mexican cars. Last time he singled out steel, aluminum, solar. Who knows what industry he might single out this time? Anything and everything outside of the United States is a potential tariff target. So what did we learn from the first round of tariffs? What kind of roadmap can we see for the second round? First, what's covered? First, we have to see what products get hit with the tariffs and which tariffs might be lucky enough to avoid them. He did say all products, but it still seems more likely than not that it will still just be some or a lot more than before. The other thing is, last time there was a process for people to ask for an exclusions from the tariffs. They could say there weren't any US suppliers of the product, so that's why the Chinese imports needed to come in. Hopefully, this time the exclusion process will be a little more transparent and will grant more than a handful of exclusions. Next, what options do you have if your products are definitely covered? Last time, a lot of companies decided to shift their production and sourcing out of China and into another country, usually somewhere in the Southeast Asia. They found legal ways to change the country of origin of their products. Depending on the products and their production process, companies were still able to use Chinese parts as long as they could further process them enough in Vietnam or whatever country so that they were substantially transformed into a new product and thus get a new country of origin. So even if Trump imposes tariffs on imports from all other countries, the 10 to 20% tariff will still probably be less than 60% that he imposes on China. Bottom line is, tariffs are taxes. They are an import consumption tax. They will most likely be paid by US importers and passed on to US consumers. The big lie is that they will not be paid by foreign countries or foreign exporters or producers. They won't reduce the tariffs. They won't reduce the trade deficit. They won't bring back US manufacturing. They won't solve any Chinese IP issues. They'll only further increase costs and harm the US and global economy. Like it or not, we're all getting back on the Trump trade roller coaster. Buckle up. It's going to be a bumpy ride. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Adams. Our next speaker is 𝗃𝙧𝙧𝙧𝙀𝙧. 𝗃𝙧 is a business immigration lawyer who primarily assists companies, both in the United States and around the world, with their U.S. immigration law needs. And 𝗃𝙧 heads up our immigration practice. I'm going to turn it over to you now, 𝗃𝙧.
Thank you, Dan. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, wherever you're joining us from. Undoubtedly, the second Trump administration is going to bring about a sharp change in immigration policy, and in particular, immigration enforcement. Hot off the press, yesterday, Trump appointed Tom Homan, a hardliner, as his border czar. And even hotter off the press, this morning, he announced that Stephen Miller, his architect for the first administration immigration policies, is going to be his deputy chief of staff for policy. So, the agenda that the administration has planned in the first 100 days is going to be very aggressive. You can see here the restrictions on lawful immigration. So what I've identified here are essentially, hot topics that we expect to see action on very early on. And so the restrictions on lawful immigration pertains to going after lawful visa categories, H-1B visas for specialty occupations, L-1s for intra-company transfers, O-1s for extraordinary ability individuals. And the idea here is that the specialty occupation, or the definitions, will be interpreted very differently and very restrictively to yield a greater number of denials. Jobs that are at the entry level are also likely to get denied for H-1B status. So an aggressive policy seeking to drive down the number of H-1Bs that are approved every year. On top of that, you have the travel bans and vetting. We've seen this before as well. And what that entails essentially is extreme vetting, not just based on countries where the visitors or the visa holders are trying to come in from, but also based on ideology. And that is going to be through monitoring of social media. And it will be, a very different scenario than it was before with the visas with the visas at the consulates. Going on to rise in investigations and audits, this is also a big priority with going after unlawful immigrants, undocumented workers, and punishing not just the worker by putting them in removal proceedings, but also the employer who hires them. Along with that, you're going to see that there are going to be longer processing times, both in terms of staff reductions and these draconian measures that will be put in place to enforce new policies. You're going to expect immigration benefits to take a lot longer. And lastly, the end of birthright citizenship is a very hot topic. What that, in a nutshell, what that includes is individuals who are born in the United States to undocumented individuals, parents are not going to be eligible for U.S. citizenship. And that could essentially go on to even people who are here as lawful non-immigrants, but are not U.S. citizens or green card holders. So I can answer more questions on that later on, but thank you.
Hello again, everyone. I am here now to talk about how a Trump administration will reshape U.S.-Asia relations and why that should matter to all of us. First, though, a little bit about me. I am an international lawyer who helps companies that operate internationally. Until COVID, my work was largely centered on Asia, which mostly meant China. But in today's post-COVID world, Asia now comprises only about half of my practice, and I expect to see that continue to decline. In his previous term, President Trump brought huge shifts to trade and military dynamics across Asia. By stepping back from multilateral agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, and instead favoring bilateral deals, he put U.S. interests in the spotlight. Through high tariffs, tech export controls, and aggressive trade policies, President Trump created a new normal in U.S.-Asia relations. We can expect these policies under Trump round 2 not just to return, but to intensify. Trump previously raised tariffs on China, nearly all of which are still in effect. During the recent election campaign, he repeatedly stated that he would raise tariffs on China to 60% of elected. This would accelerate U.S.-China decoupling, impacting the quality, price, and availability of just about everything we buy. At first, I didn't take Trump's plans to enact 60% tariffs on Chinese products seriously, but I do now. And I'm not alone. Trump's return to office has already prompted many companies to start or speed up plans to move production out of China. I've read about these companies, and just last Friday, 2 companies told me that their plans to move production out of China had taken on increased urgency. Countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, and India stand to gain the most from this shift. But here's the risk that could shake up the entire region. Many companies see a China-Taiwan conflict as the biggest threat to their supply chains. A blockade or invasion of Taiwan by China would throw supply chains into chaos, and even factories in places like Thailand or Vietnam could very well struggle to get critical components or to ship their products if cross-border transport is disrupted by blockades or by war. The new Trump administration will bring shifting trade patterns, rising costs, and escalating geopolitical tensions that it could impact the products we buy, the investments we make, and the world we live in. Change is coming, and as always, it won't impact everyone equally. One thing I'm going to add with respect to what Adam said, I too do not think that the increased tariffs will drive very much manufacturing back to the United States, but I definitely see it driving a lot of manufacturing out of China. And I am now going to turn the mic over to 𝗏𝗏 𝗏𝗏. Fred is a former U.S. diplomat with Latin America and China experience. Fred is now an international lawyer who heads up our Latin America practice and our international IP practice.
Thanks, Dan. Well, when we talk about Latin America in this context, obviously we have to start the conversation by discussing what is likely to happen or what could potentially happen with Mexico. Adam's already addressed the issue of tariffs generally, but in his last speech before the election, Trump announced or reiterated a willingness to impose tariffs on Mexico if the country did not stop the onslaught of criminals and drugs coming into the United States. That's the quote. And he said that this was a plan that had a 100% chance of succeeding because if it didn't work, then it would the tariffs would be increased to 50%, 75%, 100%. That's what he said, pretty much verbatim. Now, obviously, the Mexican government will try to work with the new administration to avoid this fate, and it is possible that some sort of compromise might be reached, whereby the Mexico is seen as doing enough at the behest of Trump, and that saves enough face all around to put off the prospect of these these steep tariffs. But it remains to be seen, right? I mean, given the somewhat fussy nature of the requests, stop the onslaught of criminals and drugs. I mean, it is obviously an incredibly porous border. No doubt that Mexico could do more to control its own borders, both its southern border and also the border with the U.S. But at the same time, this border has been porous for a very long time, and it's not that simple. So the bottom line is that the prospect of rather harsh tariffs being imposed on Mexican goods is out there. Whether it comes to fruition remains to be seen, but it is a real risk, and that would obviously have severe consequences for U.S.-Mexico trade, especially as many companies look at Mexico as a possible alternative to China and other Asian destinations. That could open up opportunities for other countries in the region. No country is as well placed as Mexico to play a complementary role to the U.S., but nonetheless, we could see some countries benefiting from an environment in which, let's say, both China and Mexico get hit with stiff tariffs. That could create opportunities for countries in the region. However, many of the countries in the region might not enjoy the warmest of relationships with the U.S. under a Trump administration. How much this will impact their ability to take advantage of these potential tariffs against Mexico and China remains to be seen. When we look at countries such as El Salvador and Argentina, where there is an ideological affinity between their leadership with the new U.S. leadership, that could open the door to some interesting possibilities. In the case of El Salvador, it is a country that could be an interesting alternative for some manufacturing activities. At the same time, it's a relatively small country that would pretty quickly hit a limit to what it can produce. So it might not be. I mean, it's certainly not going to be the next Mexico or let alone the next China by itself. And other countries in Central America are not don't have that ideological affinity that I mentioned. And finally, we can also expect some countries in Latin America to start moving toward or to more firmly embed themselves in the emerging world order being led by China. Part of this is going to be an increasing sense of wariness towards the U.S., doubts about the U.S.'s reliability as a partner, and also perceptions that U.S. relevance and even power are waning, and it might be time to place bets with the new emerging powers. You could see these dynamics play out in places like Brazil, Peru, and then even Mexico. Mexico has been cozying up to China over the past years, and then it might be a natural reaction, right? If they get hit with new tariffs. And in the case of the bad seeds of the hemisphere, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, we are likely to see a harsher line being taken by Washington, which could result in these countries aligning themselves even more forcefully with China and Russia, and that could open the door to any number of troubling possibilities for the region. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Fred. Our next speaker is Shannon Brandau. Shannon is an American lawyer with multiple degrees in EU law and business from European universities. She is currently based in Portugal, where she works with our Portuguese attorneys to help foreign companies and individuals with their Portuguese legal matters. She also leads our Europe practice.
Thank you, Dan. Well, Europe is ready. That's what the European Parliament said. We don't know if that's just political speech or if they're really, really ready for Trump 2.0. I'm here in Portugal, as Dan said. It is 5 o'clock, after 5 my time. And on the news, all you see seems to be commentary on how Donald Trump is going to relate to Europe. So I'm going to try to give you 3 areas of US-EU relations that I believe will become sticking points in the future. And that's really based on his first term. But also things have changed since his first term that make things a great deal more dicey. And when I'm talking about things have changed, I really mean that that Russia has invaded Ukraine, and Europe is on edge and very concerned about its security. So security has become front and center for this region. The number one sticking point really is going to be Trump's approach. Trump's approach is a nationalist and transactionalist foreign policy approach. And what that means is he's going to take a very narrow view to issues, and he's going to make deals, and these deals maybe disparate deals from larger issues that might even implicate the deals. So that leaves Europe feeling apprehensive. It doesn't really know which way the ball will roll. But I will give you one example to take away from this potential tension, if you will, and that is, I think it was back in September, the Vice President-elect, J.D. Vance, suggested that the U.S. might consider removing its support from NATO if the EU continued to target social media platforms, and especially Elon Musk's X. That Vance shared concerns about what he said were threats to free speech during an interview where he mentioned that an EU official had sent Musk a letter about possible arrest for allowing Trump on the platform. In fact, Musk had been advised by Terry Breton, the former Internal Market Commissioner, about the EU's harmful content rules, which are EU laws on freedom of expression. The EU had already been warning X on its failure to comply with the Digital Services Act regulations on advertising, transparency, account verifications, and things like that. And Musk has already been accused here in the EU of suspending accounts of journalists who covered or criticized him. So this was a bit of a left hook, if you will, for Europe, for Vance to link Musk's troubles to NATO support is a really, it's something that not a lot of people is going to see coming, but this could very well characterize Donald Trump's relationships with other regions of the world, and especially with Europe. So that's left a bad taste in folks' mouth here. The second sticking point that I would talk about is certainly going to have to do with trade. You heard Adams talk about tariffs. Well, those tariffs are going to also apply to EU. We've got ongoing trade disputes that have been, well, since the first Trump administration on steel and aluminum, and those disputes are expected to get worse. In general, economic-wise, Trump has said or suggested that he will make moves that will impact central banking, that is making Europe nervous, because the implications are that it might weaken the euro against the dollar if his policies are enacted. And his proposals could unsettle US financial regulations, which would affect global, which includes European financial stability. The third and final sticking point I have, since time is really short, is definitely security. Trump's approach, this transactional approach, particularly in light of the ongoing war in Ukraine, is making a lot of folks nervous here. They are reacting to the unpredictability of Trump's foreign policy and the potential risks to the region. I've noticed, for example, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen mentioning a lot more recently that Europe needs to be able to defend itself. Now, there's been talk for years about an integrated European army. That's something that folks are taking a greater interest in and have been ever since Putin invaded the Ukraine. But at present, NATO still is very crucial, obviously, for European defense. And I think that if Trump wants to revisit that issue of European spending and contributing to NATO with a threat of pulling the US out or reducing support in some way, I think he's going to have an easier time post the Ukraine invasion of getting countries to meet their spending obligations. So this is one area where a lot of people expect a little bit more concession on Europe's part. Now, there are countries that are meeting their obligations, and then there are countries that aren't. And there's been a lot of talk. It did not start with Trump. There has been talk for years that more money needs to go in. So, so this is one area where his approach might work. We'll just have to see. My conclusions are that Trump is going to be unsettling for Europe, and the tariffs obviously are going to impact Europe. And this linking of disparate issues, if he does that, is really going to throw a curveball for US-EU relations. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. And we are now going to be opening it up for questions. So the first question that we got live is a question that we got many times by guests before we even began. And that is, when do you see the China tariffs going into effect? And how do you see China retaliate? Adams, can you lead off?
It took about 2 years last time for the China tariffs to actually kick in. So 2018 was when they finally went into effect. This time around, will they go faster? Yes, but they'll still probably have to go through some notice and comment period. And so it will probably take at least a year to get through before the tariffs kick in.
Okay. And why don't you very briefly describe the retaliations that China made to the last tariffs? Because I'm expecting it'll be similar this time around as well.
China did retaliate with their own set of tariffs against US exports to China, but China was actually pretty measured. They responded to an equal value of what was imposed on them. China realized that getting into a tariff war is not healthy for them because tariffs are really a self-inflicted wound. So they don't want to get into a huge tariff war of this scale. It doesn't help them. So I think they're going to try to be as measured as possible, like last time, but maybe they'll be more selective in terms of going after U.S. companies operating in China as a way to retaliate. So, all possibilities are there for under the Chinese legal system in China to enforce against U.S. interests, just as the U.S. is looking at U.S. laws to enforce against Chinese imports.
Yeah, that is actually my big fear, that China will step up its bad treatment of Americans and American companies in China as retaliation. Okay, next question. What do you see as the impact of tariffs for items from China imported to Puerto Rico? That's the question, but we've also gotten a lot of other questions with respect to what happens if Chinese product is sent to Mexico and then shipped to the United States. And so I hate to go back to Adams again, but when you talked about how companies could move their production elsewhere, but would need to make sure that they change the country of origin of their product, I'm reminded of the fact that many people out there, including relatively sophisticated companies, think that by shipping product from China to Mexico and having someone put the product together there and shipping it to the United States will clear you of any China tariffs, but that is absolutely not true. So Adams, could you speak to the Puerto Rico and the Mexico and the everywhere else issue?
Yeah, Puerto Rico is kind of simple and straightforward. Puerto Rico is part of the U.S. Customs territory. So if you're shipping to Puerto Rico, you're actually already shipping to the United States. So, shipping to Puerto Rico doesn't really help you change the country of origin. If you go to Mexico, however, you have a shot at creating a Mexico product out of Chinese parts. But you can't just simply bring in Chinese parts, put in simple assembly, screwdriver, assembly operations that are really basic. That's not a substantial transformation. So you have to have a fairly sophisticated production process in Mexico to achieve a substantial transformation. And that is not done by formula. It's a product specific, company specific, industry specific analysis. So it gets pretty complicated. It's often more art than science in terms of defining where that line is, where a substantial transformation happens. So that's why it's pretty complicated to figure that where that line is.
Okay. All right. What will be the Trump administration's stance toward Latin American mining countries that can provide critical minerals to boost domestic manufacturing in the United States? Fred, what are your views on that?
Well, independent of what a specific country offers to our economy, I think the first considerations are going to be on top level ideological considerations, right? So, of course, it could, as always happens, if a country has a product that is needed by American companies, that might impact the way that the relationship with that country is handled, and then that would actually be consistent with this transactional approach that we hear about all the time. But at the end of the day, I think what's really going to matter is where this country resides in the hierarchy of affinity to the new administration. So it's just really going to depend. If you're talking about a place, let's say like Argentina, which has obviously a very vibrant mining sector, at the moment you have the ingredients in place for a very close relationship, given the admiration that has been expressed by the president of Argentina towards President-elect Trump. Not sure, but there might have been complimentary comments going the other way as well. But it's important to remember that one of the things that makes democracy is the fact that governments can change, right? So I think for companies thinking that things are going to be that conditions are going to be favorable in a certain country and not favorable in another country, I think it's important to keep in mind that the governments in those countries could change. We've seen this happen in the region. Countries that were considered some of America's strongest allies in the region have made it onto the other list, and that could happen as well. So I think it's going to depend really on the impact is going to be determined on a country by country basis and the overall relationship with the U.S.
Thanks, Fred. Quick follow-up question for Adams. If you do complete the substantial transformation on the Chinese imported goods in Mexico, will it enter the United States as a Mexican product?
Yes, if you can do that, you can. And if it's as a Mexican product, you also could get benefits under the USMCA, but that's a whole other set of hurdles to jump through too. So you may get a double bonus if you can bring it in as a Mexican product and qualify for USMCA benefits as well. But that's a nice needle to thread if you can achieve it.
Okay. All right. So Akshat, a question for you. What will the Trump administration's visa and other immigration restrictions mean for people already in the United States here working on visas?
Yeah, it's a question we get a lot. I already have my visa. If I'm applying for an extension, what does that mean for me? We saw this during the first administration. The policy was to remove the deference given to prior approvals. In other words, if you have status, when you apply to extend, the government gives deference to that prior approval and doesn't scrutinize the petition as if it were filed de novo, like for the first time. And that deference is going to go away. We're pretty sure of that. The officers will be asked to evaluate the evidence all over again. And what that's going to result in essentially are requests for evidence, notices of intent to deny. These are tools that the Immigration Service has to ask for additional evidence beyond what is supplied. So, what we typically do is we front load a lot of the evidence, anticipating the issues. You don't get a second chance to make a first impression. So that's definitely the key thing to keep in mind. And secondly, keep, for employers especially, maintain your I-9 files, keep your immigration documentation, make sure that everything is in order, because there will be investigations and audits, and you don't want to scramble simply because you are disorganized. You don't want to scramble and have somebody's status extension denied or have to leave the U.S. because of that. So organization and being proactive are the two most important things, and patience.
Okay. All right. So this is definitely the question I am asked most often by clients. And I always find it very difficult to answer. The question is, it's actually a series of questions. Will the Trump administration change the likelihood of China invading or blockading Taiwan? And between these two scenarios, which do you see as the most likely, and how will these two impact supply chains? And I'm actually going to turn to Shannon to answer this, because even though Shannon is in Europe and focuses a lot on Europe, she's also fluent in Chinese and used to live in China and deals a lot with China as well, especially the political side. So I'm going to let you lead, and I'm going to ask plenty of others as well.
Okay. I would say it does increase the chances, but only if Trump does what we all think he's going to do, which is to make some sort of deal to pressure Ukraine to surrender to Russia, because that will, and if I believe that that will embolden Beijing to then set upon Taiwan.
Okay. And how do you see, how will a blockade and war impact global supply chains?
Oh,
Obviously,
wow.
it'll impact those that are tied to China, but what about other places?
Well, do you remember when we had all that disruption from COVID and all of the, you know, the backlogs when China, I mean, that in my mind, that would pale into in comparison of what, you know, a conflict or a blockade in the East China Sea and in the South China Sea might do. So it's all a ripple effect, isn't it? And a blockade, you know, China will then declare hegemony over the region and decide what ships get through and what ships don't get through. And if you think the enemy's ships, whoever the enemy is, if that's us or if that's just Taiwan, well, we don't know. But if you think the enemy's ships are getting through, well, no, they're not. You know, 𝗲𝗏 will not like to see competition in the Chinese market from Samsung or from, you know, Apple anymore. So it just has a ton of knock-on effects. We don't need a blockade of Taiwan. We don't want that. No one wants that.
Fred, what are your views?
Well, although the U.S. response to increased aggression against Taiwan is obviously an important consideration, I think fundamentally there are other considerations that are more important from the point of view of the Chinese, and those are ultimately going to be the key factors. Any action against Taiwan is going to be contingent on military factors. There are very open questions regarding the ability of China to pull off some of the more ambitious coercive actions against Taiwan. And there are related political questions. There are questions that involve the day after in Taiwan. If you embark on these adventures, there are questions as to what happens in China. There are questions as to what happens in the region. So, of course, the attitudes prevailing in Washington are going to be an important consideration for the Chinese going forward, but by no means the only ones.
Thank you. What I will add to that is that people often ask me when China is going to blockade or invade Taiwan, and I always tell them I've probably read every article ever written on that, and I still have no idea, and don't believe anyone who puts a date on it, because I don't think anyone really knows when or even if China will do anything with Taiwan. I don't even think President Xi knows, and if he does, he could change his mind on that tomorrow. But one thing I will say is that I do see increasing China-Taiwan tensions impacting supply chains, and I think it will impact supply chains well beyond China, not just because China will supply component parts, but because I think companies will become very afraid of doing business with countries near China, which I think is a real shame, but that is definitely already happening. We have clients who are saying, I'm tired of Asia. It's just too risky. I'm going to Mexico or wherever. And just very briefly on Mexico, I think I might be the only optimist in the world out there. I've even invested in Mexico stock funds. I think Mexico is going to turn out to be probably the largest beneficiary of the China tariffs. I think Trump has singled out Mexico because he wants to put the squeeze on them with immigration. I think Mexico's new president is very savvy and will handle that well. And I see Mexico as really thriving in the next 5 years. But if I had a company, would I set up a factory in Mexico right now? No, I probably wouldn't set up a factory anywhere right now. I'd wait a little bit. Okay, moving on to another question here. We've gotten a lot of questions regarding the impact all of this is going to have on food prices. Does anyone want to answer that? Does anyone have a sense for what's going to happen with food? How will it be different than other products?
Yeah, no, food is a big issue, particularly with Mexico. A lot of our fresh produce is coming from Mexico. And so if Trump wants to go after Mexican products and specifically Mexican fresh produce, that's going to have a direct impact to drive up significantly prices for food. Fresh vegetables, tomatoes, squash, cucumbers, all of that is in line for a significant increase in price if Trump goes after Mexico or anything food related. And that would affect the lower middle income people more than the people with higher incomes. It's a disproportionate effect on the lower incomes there.
Okay. All right. So here's a question. Could, instead of China pushing down hard on U.S. companies in China, could the Chinese government play ball with them to incentivize them? After all, big multinationals having a production presence in China have direct lobbying power with the U.S. government. I love this question because I very proudly reveal that I got this issue not just wrong, but completely 180 degrees wrong when Trump instituted the tariffs the first time. I predicted that the Chinese government would crack down hard on American companies and Americans in China, and they did the exact opposite. Having been proven wrong once, I'm going to make the exact same prediction again because I think relations have deteriorated even more, and I don't see this happening, but anything is possible. Does anyone want to add to that?
I would add that there's talk about the relationship and of Musk to Beijing and then Musk to Donald Trump, and that there's talk that he may become the new intermediary between the two. But it's a very, very tricky and delicate situation for everyone involved because all of the players are quite mercurial. That's one, but two, Musk is involved in the great space race. He's got SpaceX, he's got Starlink, which is helping Ukraine defend itself at present, and something that China, the People's Liberation Army, has been writing articles on for the past, 6 years, saying that they want that system, and if they can't have the system, they want to do better than that system. They see it as a number one national security objective to beat him in that race if they can't borrow his system. So these are extremely complex issues, and it comes down to a number of mercurial personalities. But it is possible, that he would act on Beijing's. I shouldn't say it this way. It is possible that he could be sought out to lobby on behalf of Beijing or vice versa, that Trump will ask him to go to Beijing and ask and press them for something, I think.
Yeah, I guess in some ways it comes down to whether the tariffs are being enacted for political or monetary reasons. And I'm not sure that once they're enacted, that dividing line will have much meaning, particularly to people in China. But I guess that remains to be seen. Okay, let me pull up another question here. For the last couple years, we keep hearing about companies moving their manufacturing out of China or diversifying away from China. Where are you seeing companies moving their manufacturing, and what countries do you see replacing China? Fred, I'll give you the first crack at this one.
Sure. First thing to point out, and this is a point that's often made, that there never will be a replacement as such. You cannot replicate what China represents in terms of a manufacturing base that is also connected to the world's largest consumer market. So ultimately, what alternatives exist is going to depend on the specific business and whether they want to tap into the China market, et cetera. But we are seeing increasing interest in Mexico, of course, and it's not only American companies; it's also Chinese companies that are looking at Mexico as a potential springboard to the U.S. market and to the Latin American market, and Indian companies that are doing that as well. We are seeing increased interest as well in India. Vietnam has long been an alternative to China for many companies. We do hear very often concerns about Vietnam just not having sufficient capacity for additional work. For some other Southeast Asian countries, such as the Philippines, Indonesia, Cambodia, might prove to be valuable alternatives. We see some companies going to Colombia and other Latin American countries. Again, depending on the product, we see companies going to places in Eastern Europe, et cetera. So it really depends. It is a mixed bag, but there is no single replacement for China, and there never will.
The weird thing about all this is that China, before all the Trump tariffs, was happy to just manufacture in China. These tariffs have pushed China to go explore the world. In fact, the tariffs may actually wind up strengthening China's position in the world as China spreads out economically around the world to all corners to expand their manufacturing bases. That economic power is going to translate to political power, and China may wind up stronger in the world than they were before all the tariffs were imposed.
Yeah, and we have certainly been seeing a lot of Chinese companies looking to manufacture in Mexico. We must have been contacted by probably 20 of them, of which I would estimate roughly 19 of them plan to go into Mexico in violation of various Mexican and U.S. laws when they ship the product back to the U.S. And I suspect those companies are not going to succeed. But what I find very interesting is the fact that some serious Chinese companies have already gone into Mexico, and they're going to comply with the laws, and they'll be able to ship product into the United States that are deemed to be made in Mexico. And that is making a lot of people in the Trump administration very unhappy. And I predict that eventually there will be tariffs put on Chinese-owned companies, no matter where they are in the world. Fred's nodding yes to that, and I think Shannon was also nodding yes to that. I mean, obviously that's a possibility. I guess I'll turn to Adams. How likely is that?
Well, the smart way to fight China is to coordinate with the rest of the world. But Trump is antagonizing the rest of the world just as much as he is at China. So by pushing the rest of the world away, he's actually hurting his ability to go after China in the way that probably could or should restrain the Chinese expansion around the world. So should he coordinate with Mexico to try to limit China's expansion? Yes. Will he? Probably not. That's the thing.
Right. And a lot of the Mexican lawyers we speak with and work with are saying that Mexico's very cognizant of this problem, as is Vietnam. These countries do not want the United States slapping a 600% tariff on them because Chinese products that are really not Vietnamese products or not Mexican products are coming out of those places. Okay, so turning to you, Shannon, in Europe, where are people going that are leaving China?
They're going mostly Eastern Europe. You've got a lot of manufacturing going into Poland, Hungary. The Chinese are actually setting up BYD, I think, has a brand new center, billion-dollar center in Hungary. Either it's just an agreement or they've started building, I don't know yet. And when I say BYD, that's the Chinese electric vehicle automaker. That's Hungary. They're going into the Baltic. They're even coming here in Portugal. We've got an auto parts industry, and the Portuguese government has been trying to attract new industries here. A lot of countries in Europe are very aware of Brussels is talking about diversification all the time. And so they have to, the companies have to go somewhere, whether they're US companies or European companies or Japanese companies. So there are a number of EU member states that are intentionally, working really hard to try to attract the business with new tax incentives or just immigration incentives, what have you. So it's an interesting time. There's the immigration laws here in Europe, for example, are constantly changing to reflect the new situation that's on the ground, and so the laws. They're volatile in a kind of in a good way, and not necessarily in a bad way. There's just a lot of activity. They stayed kind of the same for a very long period of time, and then after Putin invaded Ukraine, there was an enormous amount of pressure put on the member states to do something to limit and control and better vet people. So that led to a lot of migration law changes. But on top of that, they use migration to attract economic investment, and so they want a piece of the pie. So if you're interested in coming to Europe, let us know. There are different deals happening at different times. We can look into it for you.
Okay, so we have gotten a shockingly large number of questions regarding U.S.-Canada relations. What are your views on that? I guess what I will say is I'll mention what Adams mentioned, which is that under Trump 1, I was disappointed with the fact that President Trump seemed to view Canada as an enemy almost equivalent to China, because I certainly do not see them that way, especially since my youngest daughter will soon be marrying a Canadian. But what are everyone else's views on what's going to happen there?
Trump is a bully, and everyone is a bully target. Even his closest friends are bully targets. So Canada, even though they're probably our closest trading partner, they're going to get hit just like everyone else. maybe not as hard not as much as others, but they're going to get hit.
And so that also answers the food issue. We should expect rising prices in maple syrup.
Oh.
Okay, let me pull up some more questions here. Oh, I'm sorry. This is actually our time is up. We thank everybody for attending. I should have mentioned this sooner. There is a recording of this somewhere. Just write us and we'll tell you where once it goes live, or you can check our various websites and find out. And if anyone has any additional questions or questions that were not answered here, send them to us, and we will gather up all the unanswered questions and do a quick blog post where we briefly answer them. So thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you.